This happened when I was a child of barely 5 years old. My family lived in a rather old house, a rather sprawling property with a basement. Being an only child, I had always wanted a dog, but my mother was extremely against the idea, saying that it would be impractical to get a dog now, and that I should wait for a few more years before I was grown up enough to care for one myself. One afternoon, I was running around the house as usual when my ears picked up the slightest traces of a whimpering sound. It was very faint, but it did seem to be coming from the basement. That very night, I was woken up suddenly by the sound of something scraping against the basement door. For a very brief moment, I wondered if it was a puppy, and my mother had softened her stance and gotten me one. But why would she try to keep it a secret from me? The next morning, I asked my mother directly whether there was something in the basement or someone.
What gave you that idea?
I told her about the scraping and whimpering noises I'd heard the previous day. Once more, her voice was very stern as she forbade me from going down into the basement. "It's for your own good that you don't know everything," were the words she used. In fact, thinking back to the conversation, her voice was more of a plea rather than a stern warning. Since then, however, I could hear the whimpering and scraping noises almost every day, multiple times a day on occasion. Once, and only once, I could have sworn I heard a very distinct bark in there, which only gave more credibility to my puppy theory. However, every time I did try to sneak in there to see what the secrecy was about, the door to the basement room would always be locked. Until the day it wasn't. It was late afternoon, almost close to evening, when I heard the whimpering sounds again. Quietly, I walked from my room down to the basement, and I realized what was different this time. There was no lock on the door. I listened more intently, but it all appeared to be silent on the other side of the door. Without really thinking, I pushed the door open. The sight that met my eyes was unnatural to say the least, but before I could do anything about it, I could feel someone yanking me away from the room and slamming the door shut. It was my mother, with a look of horror on her face. I tried to ask her a question, but she shushed me with a finger to her lips. There was no pretense this time, as she begged me not to tell anyone what I had seen in the basement. She offered to buy my silence for the price of one cookie a day for the next 10 years of my life. To my 5-year-old brain, that seemed like an excellent deal, and I accepted. It's been close to half a century since that day, and my mother is long gone, so I suppose I am not bound by any secrecy clauses. That day in the basement, the thing in the basement whimpered and crawled along the floor like a puppy. When it saw me, it even reached forward and tried to lick my palms. Except that it wasn't a puppy. It was a boy around my own age, and it had no legs and no arms. All he did was roll across the floor on his stomach and whimper from time to time.
When my daughter was 3 years old, she started pressing her hands to the sides of her head one day. It happened out of the blue and soon became a daily routine, almost bordering on obsession. I asked her if she was trying to exercise or do yoga, and she shook her head. Then, in a rather deadpan voice, she leaned in and said it was to keep away the headaches. I panicked for a second, thinking she was suffering from headaches, but she quickly reassured me that was not the case. That night, I woke up to find my daughter sitting on the edge of the bed, doing the same pressing routine. "Do you have a headache?" I asked in a very gentle voice. Again, she reassured me she didn't. Then she told me something rather extraordinary. Someone had been teaching my daughter about headaches. He would only come at night and had told her not to wake me up, because then I might be cross with both of them. Then he told her about headaches, how to deal with them, and how to keep them at bay. This pressing the sides of your head technique was one way, apparently. The next thing my daughter told me put a rather dark spin on this entire situation. This man had told my daughter that he had passed away because of a headache, and he just wanted to look out for her. He told me that you knew him. "His name is Patrick," my daughter said in her plain talking way. My own head started to spin as I asked her what this man looked like. He had jet black hair, rather sad eyes, and was almost 6 feet tall. 3.5 years ago, a few months before my daughter was born, I was dating a restaurant owner for a brief period of time. The relationship was going well, and I was giving serious consideration to marrying him. One day, he started complaining of mild headaches, and even though I suggested getting it checked by a doctor, he wanted to fight through the pain. A month after that, he dropped dead. The cause of death was a brain aneurysm. You might be wondering how this ties in with my daughter. Well, if anyone asks me what he looked like, I would say this. He had jet black hair, rather sad eyes, and was almost 6 feet tall. The exact same words my daughter used, and he had died before she was even born. One final detail. My boyfriend's name? It was Patrick.
My late uncle, who used to be a long-haul truck driver, told me this story. While he was mostly involved in the transport of goods from one state to another, he did have the occasional hitchhiker who would request him for a ride, every once in a while. One night, he saw a young girl flagging down his truck. She was in her early 20s, wearing a business skirt with a red scarf around her neck, and a rather unfortunate delay with the train services meant she was stranded 100 miles away from her home, and wondered if my uncle would be kind enough to offer her a ride. The journey was rather pleasant, and they got to talking. The girl was a sales representative at some cosmetics company and had to frequently travel for work. But it's Thanksgiving tomorrow, so it would mean a lot to my mother that I spend it at home. She was very grateful to my uncle. Around 3 hours later, the sun was just approaching the horizon as the truck finally left the highway and entered the town where the girl lived. Near a convenience store, the girl asked my uncle to drop her. "But isn't your home another 10 minutes away?" The girl said she would be doing some surprise shopping for her mother, and she would walk the remainder of the way home. She thanked him once again, and my uncle drove off. My uncle stopped at a guest house for the night, and as he was about to get off the truck and park it away, he noticed a red scarf on the passenger seat. It must have belonged to the girl. He was still in the same town, however, and decided it wouldn't be too much of a hassle to drive to the girl's home and return the scarf to her. A half hour later, he was standing opposite to the rather old and crumbling building. He knocked on the door, and a tired-looking lady in her 50s answered it. He remembered the girl talking about shopping and asked if the woman had received any gifts. "What gifts are you talking about?" The woman was genuinely surprised, and my uncle felt a little embarrassed. He handed her the red scarf and simply told her that her daughter had forgotten it in his truck. The woman's face went rather pale when she heard this. "Son, my daughter died more than 5 years ago." What she said next made the previous night's journey seem even more spooky. The lady's daughter had died wearing the same scarf that my uncle had just handed over. He never did find out any more about that mysterious late-night hitchhiker,